Hello and welcome to this episode of Leadership Guest Practices. The traditional domination of men in senior leadership positions is being challenged as female leaders continue to break down old barriers and demand change. There's a long way to go, but we've seen at very senior levels female political leaders make the difference when tackling the pandemic. Iceland, Finland, Germany, and of course Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, for example, which is widely regarded as the best demonstration of strong leadership balanced with strong empathy, a key combination within human-centered leadership which is being demanded more and more in business globally. My two guests are not only married to one another, but married to a commitment to bring gender diversity to workplaces everywhere. They pioneered the unique Male Allies program, specifically designed to help male leaders and senior managers navigate gender diversity waters and become advocates for equality in the workplace, in boardrooms and meeting rooms everywhere. Mette Johansson, based in Singapore, founder and CEO of MetaMind, executive coach, co-founder of Keynote Women Speakers Bureau and best-selling author, describes the program like this. Our Male Allies program is designed to move the needle on gender equity in your organisation, creating a safe space to open up about inclusion and focusing on how to develop allyship as well as the benefits of acting as an advocate in the workplace. Axel Johansson is of course also based in Singapore and has wide-ranging corporate experience including roles in Japan, Germany and Southeast Asia. Axel is a seasoned sales and marketing leader and an ICF accredited executive coach, and he says of the program, the skills and examples we provide will focus on many dimensions of inclusion, whether gender, ethnicity, age, ability or sexual orientation. Our deep dive into the gender diversity area will not only increase awareness in the workplace, but also help participants to develop awareness in their personal lives. Let's hear more. Hello and welcome to this episode of Leadership Guest Practices, where we put gender diversity at the heart of our discussion. We're calling all male allies to be advocates for gender diversity in the boardrooms, executive meeting rooms, and across the business. Joining me today is the dynamic duo of Mette and Axel Johansson, who run the Male Allies program. Mette, perhaps I can start with you. Thank you very much for joining me. Could you explain a little bit about yourself, your passion, and your leadership in all things gender diversity?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm Mette Johansson, as you said. I lead a leadership consultancy that focuses on the people side of leadership skills. And in fact, I rolled into the topic of diversity and inclusion. First of all, I did study at university already cultural intelligence, cross-cultural management, and I lived in 11 different countries. I was 2 years old when my parents moved from one country to another. So it was something that was a natural evolution. When I started this leadership training business, one of my first clients was Citibank, and they wanted me to be part of their Women in Leadership Development program. It wasn't really a choice that I made, it came to me. And today, 50% of what I do is in the area of leadership development. Now, my passion for it, sometimes I jokingly say I couldn't care less about women. Now, this is of course not completely true. What drives me is more creating a more fair, just, equitable world. And women definitely need to have a little bit more of an equitable workplace on a daily basis. That is what drives me.
And well, that's great to say, fair, just and equitable world. Most of us are looking at that now, and so much more chatter around that in leadership rooms everywhere, in boardrooms, but at government level too. And hopefully we can start making some progress. So perhaps coming to you, Axel, and asking you to introduce yourself, but what makes you and Mette such a fantastic double act when we consider very specifically gender diversity inside and, as we just said, outside of the corporate walls?
Well, thanks, Jeremy. I'm Axel Johansson, and I started studying international management and joined an industry that by tradition only had about 30% plus women applying. So traditionally rather male-oriented. Spent over 20 years in that scene. And I had the opportunity to work in Japan relatively early in my career. And so there were industry meetings sometimes where I was where there were no women present. Now, the interesting thing is there were also plenty of meetings where I was the only foreigner at that meeting in Japan. So I know a little bit of what it feels like to be the odd one out. That's certainly something that women often face in their work life. And of course, having lived and spent well over 20 years with a Scandinavian woman, emancipated as it is, I observed a few things. You know, Mette and I, we started our career at the same time, pretty much in the same company, to be honest, and purely by chance, I would say. I was just expatriated early, and Mette then joined and was kind enough to support the family in this regard. And every time we moved, she had to establish herself fresh from the start, pretty much within the same company, though. And at some point of time, I realized it's not quite fair the way it is. And of course, Mette also helped me open my eyes to some of the things that we men, including myself, of course, unknowingly do, some of the behaviors we do, and some of the systems we support that are not really helping the gender equity cause.
Yeah, and such an important topic. And of course, there are broader lenses, and perhaps coming to you, Mette, on this. You know, we've been talking about gender diversity, but a lot of the other diverse and inclusion debates for a long time, be it race, be it gender, be it sexuality, etc., etc. So why should all of that be in sharper focus right now as we look to the decade ahead?
Right now there is momentum to change things. And why do we need to change it? Not just because it's the right thing to do ethically, not just because everybody is doing it and headquarters tells us to do it, also because there is a business case of inclusion. If we look at many different studies, we can see that diversity does increase group intelligence if we can translate that diversity into an inclusive environment. There is a return on innovation when we have diversity. In fact, a Deloitte study showed that there's 9 percentage point higher EBIT in companies that have a high diversity score in comparison to those who have a low diversity score. And think about it, 9 percentage points extra EBIT. How come not everybody is focusing on this as a business case? Can you imagine a boardroom meeting and there's a couple of guys discussing, oh, I have this idea, it's ethical, it's on strategy, it gives us another 9 percentage points EBIT, but no, let's not focus on that. That's unthinkable, isn't it? With diversity and inclusion, we have a business case. Why is it not front, left, right, center, everywhere where we are doing business? We know that if we inside our companies are reflecting the diversity of our markets, we will understand our markets better and we can serve our markets better. We also know that if we have more ideas, different perspectives that are put on the table, we can choose the best one and make that our business model. So yes, this is the main compelling reason why we should focus on diversity and inclusion, because there is a business case. At least when I'm saying this is the main reason why we should do it, this is what we need to communicate internally in companies, because this is how people are convinced. Of course, I want to do it, as I said in the beginning, because it's the right thing to do. We need to have a more just and fair and equitable world.
It's interesting, though, from what you say, it's the right thing to do from a lot of different perspectives, and particularly around when you're talking about, well, why should we do it? I love the terminology, the impact on group intelligence and the new ROI, the return on innovation, but 9 percentage points on EBIT following 18 months of pandemic, when many organizations are struggling, looking for where they're getting the next elements from, and they're looking across the organization, which is better. And what I'm starting to see now, and I'll bring Axel in for this one, is more of a readiness. You know, been talking about this for so long, but there is a lot more readiness for action, let's say. So perhaps, Axel, you can bring in that perspective of what's changed over the last few years, and particularly maybe the last 18 months, that make it the right time to accelerate progress in this area. But particularly with a lens on gender diversity, challenges and opportunities?
I think the cultural movements we've seen in the past few years, in particular the Me Too movement, has certainly created a lot more awareness in all parts of the world. Not maybe to the same extent, but it certainly has created an additional awareness. And that's why I think a lot of countries are reassessing their moral compass in a way of making sure that there is more gender equity. So I think there's some really catalytic change that can happen. And I think the pandemic actually can help with that as well, because we've seen through the pandemic that those companies who have focused on the local workforce, empathized with them, and they were the ones who reacted fast and adjusted the best and they have performed better as a result as well. So I think that that will both help and support a change and facilitate faster progress.
Yeah, you make a good point, because of course we talked before about the inside and outside of the corporate walls, and the noise around this outside of the corporate walls is so much greater now, and the demands internally across a number of different things, but particularly around gender diversity too, coincide also with another point that you raise around empathy and the rise of human-centered leadership and the need for our leaders to demonstrate that. We saw that in politics, didn't we, across the pandemic, and the best performing presidents, prime ministers, you know, the women leaders that demonstrated not just the tough decision making, but the empathy that went with it across the population. And a lot of learnings within the corporate walls across that. So in order not to fall into those same traps, I'm going to come back to you on this point, Meta. You know, we seem to have a long way to go when you consider some countries, some companies, some regions in the world. But as we said, there is a much greater willingness to walk the walk in some of this areas. So first of all, how did we get to the place where we weren't making so much progress and promoting women into leadership positions, senior management, including them more in whatever projects and tasks needed to happen? How did we get to that, and how did we get over it?
So how did we get to not getting enough results from our diversity and inclusion activities? It was probably because we didn't realize what a big and daunting task it is. We didn't realize how privilege is invisible to those who have it. And if you have privilege, we don't really want to give it away, do we? That is a challenge. It's also about realizing that there are so many different levels we need to work on. It's not enough to set some KPIs. Let me give you an example, and this is back to why we must make diversity and inclusion a business case. One of my clients described that in all their policies about diversity and inclusion, they had decided that we must always bring diverse candidates on the table whenever we have a vacancy. This company had all the right policies. Now, they urgently needed to fill a senior position. And they had somebody knew somebody, and they said, all right, let's just bring him in very quickly. And this is where they skipped all their policies because there was an urgency. Now, if we know that by hiring a senior executive who might be in that position for 10, 20 years, we are delaying diversity and inclusion for 10 or 20 years, if we realize that we are missing out on 9 percentage points of extra EBIT by taking a shortcut, it's not a shortcut to anything. It is shooting ourselves in the foot. It is missing out on money if we don't make sure we adhere to our processes. And this is often what comes in the way for diversity and inclusion. That is to, oh yeah, I don't really have time for it. There's some urgencies on a daily basis. Yes, there will always be. That's why it's so important that we have a thorough understanding of what makes our business more inclusive, more equitable, and stick to those processes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you make the good point about delaying diversity is delaying growth, isn't it? And there's no other time where we need a diversity of thinking, not just the diversity internally. And this is one area where some quick gains can be made. And you both have done this and have started to walk the walk yourselves, not just started, but you've really driven this and pioneered this. So Axel, perhaps you could explain your journey with Meta to do something about this from a gender diversity perspective, walk the walk and pioneer the Male Allies program.
Well, Meta has really great experience from her Women in Leadership programs. Women benefit from learning how to effectively navigate the corporate system. The system has been created by men for men. And of course, some women point out that fixing women is not enough. It takes effort from all of us to make the world a more equitable place for all. So we need to look at culture, the systems, the processes, and how all of us can actually develop a more inclusive mindset. And I think seeing that, it really became obvious that we have to reach out to more men actually to become strong allies to make that progress for gender equity a lot faster.
Yeah, interesting words, fixing women, which kind of I go ouch on when I hear it for sure. But I totally get it. And your point about a lot of this was created by men for men, a lot of potentially and particularly the traditional organizations that are out there that are with starting the 20th century and maybe beyond that, haven't really evolved this in some ways and trying to put band-aids on all these different things rather than getting to the root cause. So the Male Allies program sounds fabulous, Meta, coming back to you. And of course, it is the Male Allies program. It is for men. So I have to ask the question as a devil's advocate, if you like, on this. Why have a program for different agendas? Isn't that going across or against the message of inclusion and diversity? And so how is it then facilitated to ensure that balanced approach if there's only men in the room?
It could seem so, absolutely. When you hear, all right, we have an all men program and we have an all women's program. Now, our experiences are that it is good to have separate discussions. For women, it is about discovering how can we be our natural, strong, powerful leaders without being influenced by the male view. And that is good to do that all by ourselves without any men in the room. And what about the male allyship? Why only have men in the room? Well, there are a lot of maybe not fears, maybe yes fears, or just anxieties or insecurities about how do I show up as a male ally? What my thoughts that I'm having, are they wrong? And we have so many thoughts that are steered by our unconscious biases that if we speak them out, we could get a little bit of a backlash. Let me give you an example. We hear sometimes on the Male Allies program of, I'm a bit worried about promoting too many women because what about my career? This is a very relevant fear to have, and it's valid. Of course, people will have this, men will have this thought. And if we are not allowed to speak this out loud and think this all the way to the end and find solutions for it, we're not advancing in society. We need to have spaces where we can table all our insecurities, fears, anxiety, wherever it is on the spectrum, so that we can advance. If you have women in the room as well, I can tell you that there will be some strong reactions such as, well, you didn't have the competition to get where you are now. And you have a lot of emotional reactions that are not helpful. The emotional reactions will then often mean that men prefer to stay quiet. I mean, we know all what our culture is like today, the cancel culture. We don't want to risk any of that. So that's why it's good to create these safe spaces where we can explore the thoughts that we have in our minds. And as women, where we can explore who are we as leaders together without somebody coming in and saying that's nonsense, because we've heard so many times that it's nonsense. So let us explore that in a same gender environment, a safe environment.
What a fabulous response. I really got it when you were talking about the women as well, you know, not being impacted by the male view in that room. And it makes total sense when you talk about it, but particularly for men, and getting over those fears, and yes, and taking away all of those like my moment before, the ouch moments that could then cause conflict in there. And as you were talking, I wrote down the word truth. You didn't mention that, but it really resonated when I sort of thought about this. This is men who are able in that room to speak the truth, speak what they really think, not speak the politics or the things that they should do, so that, as you said, we can work through that and say, you know what, okay, there are fears here, but let's work through that together. So that's a very big aha moment for me. Thank you on that, Meta. And now maybe coming back to Axel, what are some of the other aha moments then in the spirit of that, and success stories that have come out of the Male Allies program that prove the worth, if you like, Axel, of approaches like this, and involving others in that journey?
Yeah, okay. We had a webinar the other day on male allyship, and I have to say it was not just men there. There were also women participating in that particular webinar, as per a request by the client. And I really recall how, when I said male allyship actually starts at the home. It's not just something from the corporate side to be seen. It starts at the home, and all of a sudden, all the women were eagerly nodding there on the webinar. It was quite impressive to see. So that is a key topic that I think we need to address more, because often women, you know, or we as men, we often think that just doing the dishes a few times or carrying out the garbage at home is enough. But we don't realize that women often act as, to use corporate language, project managers at home, managing the whole house, managing the social activities, managing the kids, the schooling, the hobbies, etc. And then they allocate tasks to delegate those tasks to us men. And as a result, we get some stuff done, but they have this whole cognitive labor of managing the whole project. And that's certainly something that I think was pretty clear to the participants when we addressed this topic. And when it comes to success stories, we have one client actually where we've partnered with them on a number of activities. And one was the Women in Leadership program that we did. We did an Inclusive Leaders program with them, and we did the Male Allies program with them. And through the course of 1.5 years, we did this program, and as a result, they actually increased their women in leadership positions by 10 percentage points. So a substantial increase in a relatively short period of time. Now, do we know which program led to this? But the fact is, this client actually won one of the most prestigious D&I awards actually in the industry. So that was certainly a certain moment of success. We can say that.
Wow, and I'm also, with what you started to say there as well at the beginning, I've started to realize why it's good to have separate audiences for this, and good to have some of these discussions just with the men in the room on the Male Allies program, so that they can get all of these perceptions out of, you know, the kind of old school perceptions which still are there. And I suppose that's interesting, because when you do that right and everybody's committing to it, and this is the point, isn't it, that everybody's on board with it, is that 10 percentage points increase in women in leadership and what that means there, and winning awards for it. I mean, that makes a big difference with the organization. With what you brought in there, Axel, is this sort of broader view of outside of the corporate walls again, maybe Meta bringing you back in on this as well, is that this program, clearly to me, hearing you, is about changing perception. So it's mindset first, and it's moving to action, changing those words into action. So it's really important actually that we bring some of these other things out. So perhaps coming to you again, Meta, the what are those wider challenges that women still face as they continue to juggle their own work-life balance, while striving, of course, to contribute, make their voice heard, be leaders in the boardroom and businesses everywhere, which is not insignificant when you put all of that together.
There are lots of different things, of course, the culture, the processes, there are the way we do things around here, how men see us. The women needs to also make sure that they have the right skills to navigate the system that is there. It happens to be there. So there's a lot of different things that we need to work on, of course. One of the things that women are not always aware of is that we're not always discriminated against. Sometimes we're simply discredited. And back to the situation that Axel mentioned before, that he was asked to go work in a different country and I had to tag along. And what our bosses said at that point of time was, oh, Mette, why don't you take those 4 years to get a couple of kids? Produce the kids, and then you're ready in 4 years to restart your career when you get back to headquarters. That was one thing that I was told. Another thing, when I got my first kid, so I fought hard to get a position in that company because I wanted to work. And by the way, we're talking about working in Japan, in Asia. I already had work experience in Asia. Axel didn't. He was asked to work in Asia again. I had worked in Asia, and they thought it was difficult to place me. I had as high qualifications as Axel. We were on a very similar level, and I was asked to, why don't you take care of the family for 4 years? Then another thing that happened was when I got pregnant with our first son, I was asking for maternity leave and then to come back into my position. Now, this is in Japan, where you barely have any maternity rights, at least not at that point of time in the late 90s. I was told, Mette, you don't know what you want. You know, when you have a baby, you probably don't want to work anymore. So why don't you just take it easy? I said, no, I know myself. I'm back on, say, March 1st. No, you don't know yourself. I've seen it so many times. Women change when they have children. Those are, of course, extreme examples. It happens to a lesser extent all the time by simply our environments not including us when we are considering who should be promoted, who should be a leader, who should have a stretch assignment. And also in our appraisal processes, women are often described as, oh, you're very nice, you're contributing nicely to the team, creating a great atmosphere, instead of saying, what are the facts and figures that helped us, where we helped the business grow? Women don't realize how often they are discredited along the way. And I believe that is one area where we need to focus on a lot as women, to realize that we are often in a worse position, and realizing that means that we can course correct and do something ourselves. So that is one advice that I have for women, to increase that awareness of what we can do. And of course, we also need the male allies. So grab some male allies and explain to them what privileges they don't have, so that they will also have a sense of fairness and hopefully support you.
Wow, some really powerful stuff there. And I love that distinction between being discriminated against and being discredited. That's very interesting, and I've not heard that before. And it just does make me cringe when you talk about the kind of narrative that was going with somebody else who apparently knows you better than you do, and this is how you're going to feel. You're going through this, and you start to say the words, and they hurt more these days as we become more aware of this, and we have to move the dial from words to actions for sure. And for sure, also, there are cultural elements into that, certainly in parts of Asia. And of course, I've done a couple of these leadership guest practices podcasts with two entrepreneurs from Africa, and they, as women leaders, told me essentially some horror stories about how young girls and women had the barriers and the roadblocks that are in place and the hurdles that they have to go across, which of course many men still don't have to. So there's a spectrum, right? So we've got to get to action. So let's get to action. So I'm going to bring Axel in now, and I want to ask you a very direct question about what men should stop, start, and continue doing at all levels in the workplace as committed allies and active advocates of gender diversity within the workplace, so that we actually make some progress.
Well, number one, research has shown that men interrupt a lot more, that they speak a lot more, whether it's in meetings, in conferences, during earnings calls, etc. So I think one of the first things we need to stop is sometimes to just stop talking and let the women, give them the voice, and just listen more. That's one thing. I think also it's clear that a lot of men actually express similar attitudes like women to support for flexible work hours or for parental leave. But the reality is, when it comes to actually making use of those benefits, then they often don't use those benefits. So I think recently I had a friend on LinkedIn actually who was very proud of getting parental leave, had a great time, spent I think a total of 2 months in parental leave, much longer than the legal requirement because the company gave it to him. And he posted some pictures and he was proud and felt good about it and thanked his company and his colleagues and his friends and so forth who supported him in that. That's the type of support women also need, when men actually voice that out and make use of those benefits and express that and talk about it, so that it's not just the women who are asking for it. I used to be in a situation where I felt when our kids were small, the peer pressure just would not allow me to use parental leave. Things have changed, fortunately, to some extent, but we can still benefit from that. And another thing I would add, we sometimes really have to speak up on behalf of women when they're being discredited, for example. You know, I remember a situation where there was a woman who was being interrupted by one of the senior leaders in the room, and you know, she's usually a pretty vocal person, and so afterwards I went to her and said, hey, I noticed this happened. How come you didn't stand up for your values? And she turned around and said, why didn't you stand up for your values? That was an aha moment for me, really. It's not enough just to be a silent ally. We have to become male advocates for women and other minorities, because then we become a much more inclusive world.
Well said. And so much speaks to me of what you just said there. And perhaps that first one, speak less and listen more, actively listen more, is a great place to start for some men, for sure. And the almost the move to demand as well as use the benefits that are there for men, so that they can start to live this against perhaps what they perceive are expectations. This is kind of old school expectations versus the modern workplace. But particularly with what you said there at the end, I think it's really important, calling colleagues out who are not walking the walk in this area, being courageous to live our values within the corporate walls and do that, being compassionate and supporting, you know, our women colleagues and our other colleagues. As you said, it's wider lenses here that we can bring in too. I think some really, really important points, of which I'm sure you go much deeper into the program as well. So I guess the natural and logical follow-up is to you on this one, Mette, which is, what should women stop and continue doing to further engage male allies and accelerate progress further?
I am a bit, struggling with answering this in one generic way, because it depends so much on the situation. If you want to engage male allies, in fact, I'm writing a book that's called Narratives, the Stories That Hold Women Back at Work. And in that, we don't only describe some of those myths, some of those narratives that women are exposed to all the time. We also describe how can women stand up and dispel the myth, shatter the narrative. Now, it depends on the situation. And it's again, how much psychological safety is there in that environment to truly rock the boat? Sometimes rocking the boat is absolutely the right way of going about things. And sometimes it is perhaps more on asking questions of saying, what do I need to do in order to get this promotion? And sometimes it's also about doing something that's a little bit more diplomatic, calling people in for a constructive discussion when you see that wrongdoings are happening, when there is injustice, when somebody is not treated fairly, whether it's you or somebody else, then having a discussion around it. Best thing is, of course, to keep emotions out, because if we simply have an intellectual conversation about what is the privilege here, what is the bias that's playing a role, conversations where we are calling male allies in to have a constructive conversation about it. Now, at the same time, I'm not excluding to rock the boat, because sometimes that is definitely needed.
Yeah, it raises another question, which I'm going to come back to you on for this, just as a piece of follow-up. But the narrative has to be shattered if that is still going on within that organization, and you have to destroy those myths, and you do have to rock the boat to do it. But you're asking and demanding for nothing short of culture change within the organization. So if that continually doesn't happen, what's the cost to the organization?
There is a big cost to the organization if we don't have that full inclusion. There will be. It is not just about the direct cost of not being able to serve your client markets as well if you don't have an internal environment that reflects your external environment. It's not just about not having all those additional ideas on the table that increases the return on innovation. It's also about what talent are you attracting to the company, for instance? If you have a culture of belonging where everybody can come and be adding value, where everybody is being appreciated for their worth, that is going to be a lot of value as well for your corporate brands.
Yeah, well said. And that cost is a huge one potentially now as we emerge from the pandemic, and competitive advantage is hard to get. And leaders have to be looking much broader these days around what makes competitive advantage. It's around the people, it's around the products, it's around the competitiveness in the marketplace for sure, but it's also about this sort of sense of leadership and what the companies like to work with. So thanks for that. Thanks for clarifying that. And Axel, also thanks for you for you both, of course, for joining me. But Axel, for those companies and male leaders who are wanting to get this into more detail into this, how do they get in touch and find out more about the Male Allies program?
The easiest would be to get in touch either via LinkedIn, Axel Johansson on LinkedIn in Singapore, or via axel@metamindtraining.com by email, and then we can take it from there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And coming back to you, Meta, of course, thank you also for joining me. And how do those tuning in get in touch with you? And actually, how do they sign up for the program?
I would love you to connect with me on LinkedIn, Meta Johansson. Of course, you can also get more information on the program if you contact us through metamindtraining.com, our website, or also info@metamindtraining.com, or drop me a note on LinkedIn. I'd be very happy to give you more information, and we'd love to have some signups for the Male Allies program. As you said, Jeremy, the time has come where we're going to put things into action. We need to put words into action right now.
It's time to walk the walk, everybody. So Meta, thank you very much for joining me. Axel, you too. I really look forward to finding out more about this. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining our Guest Practices videocast. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel through the link below, or check out our website to access more in our current series of expert interviews.